Can you make a lot out of a little? When it comes to faith in God, you certainly can. Today, I'd like to look at this idea of a faith that seems small based on what seems like a little, doing truly remarkable things. This is Eric Slawick, the UWM Pen Guy. This is the Bible Commentary. As always, if you like what you're seeing, then I would ask that you hit like and subscribe to help the channel to grow. And without further ado, then, let's get into the Word. So today I'd like to cover verses 8 and 9, which are basically part of a single block of thought in the text. And I'd like to address the question of whether of what you could refer to as the seed of faith, where Jesus says that if you have faith as a grain of mustard, which was the smallest seed in, I believe, in the field at that time. Don't quote me on those details, but it's something to that effect. That you can move mountains. And here we have a remarkable illustration of it. Because, as I suggested in a previous video, compared to what we have today, Rahab had remarkably little to go on. She merely heard of God, of the true and living God, the God of Israel, by reputation, by sort of the report of what God had done to the Egyptians and how he had defeated Pharaoh and his army and delivered his people through the Red Sea. So let's read verses 8 and 9. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And actually, I'd also like to add verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So we see that Rahab has you could say nothing and you could say everything to go on. This is the essence of real faith. She takes this little seed, this reputation she had heard, and she comes with urgency. So the first thing you see her do that is an example of this seed faith, so to speak, or seed of faith, is that it gives her urgency. She came to them in the middle of the night, essentially, when they lay down. She was, it appears that she was so eager to establish a relationship of sorts with these men who were representatives of the true and living God, that she had no one to connect to. She had no fellow believers in that city. These were the first other believers in the true God that she had ever met, and she is energetically pursuing the opportunity to join with the people of God. And this is another characteristic of a genuine faith. And the way that she heard about what God had done does indeed give us an example of how this kind of faith, or how hearing about the reputation of God can lead people to repentance. She says that the inhabitants of the land melted away before the Israelites. She obviously has seen something the spies haven't yet. And at the end of the chapter, we will see the two spies relate excitedly this to Joshua, that they saw represented through Rahab. And, because as a woman living in the wall, as a woman with a, let's say, probably popular business, she would have heard the buzz. She would have been aware of what was happening in the city. And so this is striking. And we'll talk in a bit, I believe, about this sort of way that God has prepared Jericho for its own destruction and for the conquest work of the Israelites by using his reputation. The mere hearing of the power of God to clear the way before Israel. Now, this, we can see how Rahab is taking her old way of thinking about deity, how she's taking her thinking about how pagans would have this rather mixed up way of thinking about deity, that if you've heard of any sort of pagan mythology, that the gods were fickle, they were kind of human-like, but there was the concept of wrath and reward, and there was the concept that the gods were powerful. And it seems that she's already got that framework in her mind. She's not a secular atheist who was born to secular atheist parents. She has the framework in which she can process that instead of the many gods she used to believe in, there is but, in reality, but one God. And he is above and powerful beyond any of those other gods. This is similar to what you see with King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. There you have a more in-depth retelling of exactly what this process can look like as he begins to sound more and more like a genuine believer in God, while still kind of hedging his bets and inching his way from darkness into light, until God has to humble him by basically deranging his mind and making him think that he was a cow for 7 years, to go from the highest position in the world to the lowest, to be humbled under the mighty hand of God, as the scriptures say. And then God raised him back up to his throne. One can imagine a microcosm of this happened with Rahab, because that is the essence of genuine salvation, is being humbled under the mighty hand of God. And then God raises you up to a new position in Christ as part of the family of God through Christ. And now, to get to the question of the melting away of the people, this is a fine example, actually, a prime example of what God describes himself doing in Romans chapter 1, where it says on 3, I believe, separate occasions that God gave them up. He gave them up. He gave them up. Which, that is the same word that is used for the betrayal of Jesus on the night of his death, or the night before his death, when he was betrayed by the traitor Judas. So that is what God is, obviously isn't betraying people, but he is abandoning them. He's turning them over to their own sinful desires. And in this case, he's turning them over because they heard of his reputation. And Romans 1 also says that the invisible things of God are clearly seen through that which is made. And all these people in Jericho had the invisible things of God being clearly seen through that which is made, so that they were without excuse, so that people today are without excuse. And so it appears God gave them up. He gave them up. He gave them up to their own fear, to their own dysfunctionality and helplessness in the face of God's power. Now, what will be the end result of this? Well, Jesus warns that today for people it will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And gnashing of teeth is it's that sign of irrational rage, that you've lost control of your rage, and so you're just grinding your teeth at the object of your hatred. And in hell, people will be gnashing their teeth at God. They're not going to be necessarily admitting that they deserved to be there. There may be an indicator in the story of the rich man and Lazarus that for some there may be an element of that, but for the fundamental reality that Jesus describes is the weeping and gnashing of teeth. There will be sorrow over being separated, as Paul warns, from God and from his glory for all of eternity. And there's nothing you can do about it. And you have that conscience that's still constantly pounding on you and convicting you of the fact that you're there because you deserve to be there. And so you gnash your teeth as you continually shake your fist in rebellion against that deserved punishment and that conviction that will never go away. Now, by way of comparison, this powerful faith of Rahab not only contrasts with the Gentile, pagan, secular type of unbelief in Jericho, but it also tragically contrasts with the religious, spiritual seeming type of unbelief that the previous generation of Israelites had. That as they were coming out of the Exodus, it took them but a mere matter of days at the most before they had been singing to God, celebrating what God had done for them, and then probably days later, where'd God go? Where's our food? How's he going to take care of us? And they complain, they gripe, and they whine, and they moan, and it was the beginning of a long process that ended in their final condemnation and judgment. They were all, most of them were hypocrites that would end up in hell, and on earth they would just live lives of futility, wandering around in circles. And so these are the two kinds of lost sinners, the religious and the secular. And neither one of them are genuinely fearing God, as was the case here with Rahab. Now, in verse 10, we get an illustration of exactly what it was that had driven Rahab to belief. And here we get back to our theme of this sort of seed faith and how you can do a lot with a little. That the Israelites had a lot, the Jerichoites had a little. Both of them failed except for Rahab, who heard of God and his reputation. Now, one can only imagine that this was probably a garbled account. How many times had the telephone game come into play here? Passing through merchant caravans and families and along different lines of transmission, that it wasn't like anyone from Jericho had been there during the Exodus. And yet, it was enough. Isn't that remarkable? It was enough for Rahab to believe. And it was enough that she knew that God had acted consistently over time. And we see that the fact that God delivered the Israelites from Egypt and then from Sihon and Og gave her the type of confidence she needed to know that God would deliver her from her sin. God would deliver her from the king of Jericho. God would deliver her. He would be faithful to her as he had been faithful to Israel. And she doesn't hint at Israel's rebellion, interestingly enough, and I really don't know why that is. Maybe it's just ironic. It's ironic that all the failure of sinners does not ultimately destroy. It can damage, but it doesn't destroy the testimony of God. Now, this is definitely a fulfillment. This is a very important point of what God had said in Exodus. Was one of the purposes of his judgment upon Egypt, which was God saying to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, in order that I might display my power in you, and my name might be spoken in all the earth. So this is a good example of the number of things that God accomplishes through a single action, and the kind of impact or legacy that living for God can have in ways that we couldn't begin to imagine today. Moses was faithful. Did he imagine that his faithfulness would be a means that God used not only to deliver his own people, as Moses very well knew was going to happen, but also to deliver a prostitute, I think hundreds of miles away and decades down the road? Isn't that remarkable? Keep this in mind if you're losing heart about whether what you're doing for God really is fruitful or really is worth it. That we don't know, but a fraction of how God may use what his people do for him today. Now, to bring this up into the New Testament era, Paul makes the application that this is the ultimate reason why God allows wicked rebellion, is that his power is displayed through judging sinners. It's a difficult concept. It would require a whole series of videos for me to really expand and defend this very important theme from the scriptures. But it is a very important component of the answer to the question of why there's evil and suffering in the world, and how a good and just God can allow evil and suffering. It always comes down to there being a greater good. And God's glory is always the greatest good. In addition to the fact that Pharaoh thoroughly demonstrated exactly how much he deserved justice and punishment from God. Now, it's also interesting that Rahab, or that this account shows a unity with the Pentateuch. And this is an argument I believe I've mentioned in the past. in a past video, but it's worth re-emphasizing how difficult it is to maintain consistency in a large body of written work. We don't really know who wrote Joshua. It's a distinct possibility it may have been as late as the exile. And if it were, then it's truly remarkable that there's this level of consistency. Or it might be even more remarkable if it were written near the time of Joshua. But either way, it flows seamlessly. And that may seem like a minor thing, but look today at movies trying to keep their own plots consistent, or look at people trying to have consistent policy over time in politics or in government or whatever. It's really hard to do. And so it's worth mentioning how seamlessly the Exodus narrative flowed into the wilderness narrative, flowed into Joshua, and then is picked up by Paul and given a spiritual application of a theme that was one of like 20 that was in the Pentateuch. Now, finally, you have the language that Rahab uses here. Rahab speaks like what Jesus one day was walking, and he found a man, I believe Nathaniel, and when Nathaniel saw Jesus, he said, "You're the King of Israel." And Jesus said that Nathaniel was an Israelite indeed. And that description very much fits Rahab here. She speaks like a true Israelite indeed, even though, again, raised in a Gentile pagan city with only a likely heavily garbled version of the Exodus story to go off of, and she became an Israelite indeed, where the wilderness generation had the direct working of God and the revelation through the law for decades and died in their sins, as Hebrews says, that do not be like that generation of the rebellion. Or 14 centuries later, where they had the entire Old Testament, and Jesus had to say that upon you shall all the blood of all the prophets and all the guilt of all the generations come, because I have come, I am the fulfillment of it, and you have rejected me. And here's Rahab, with just the merest fraction of that. And she believed. And so, where did she learn the language from that she used? Like the vocabulary and the way of speaking of God? It's difficult to say. Either she, again, transferred her pagan categories onto the true God, and then they sort of naturally were molded according to the character of God when God began to, the Spirit came inside of her and she was born again. She, to a certain degree, naturally knew God and knew something of God, a very basic level, but enough to know of his character. After all, even in New Testament times, with the full indwelling of the Spirit, God says that, or Paul, God says through Paul that there was no need to teach the churches about agape, selfless love, because they were God taught. God taught them about love through their being regenerated. And so something like that was probably happening here. And so, how can you do with a lot with a little? Rahab had shockingly little, and she did, to the degree it was even possible, essentially everything. She knew God, she knew of God, she knew God, She had faith. She acted on that faith. She became a model of faith for all future generations and entered into the line of Messiah. So that, I guess, is the theme here, that you can do a lot with a little. And however, if you haven't accepted Christ, then you don't have anything to work with to begin with. So I would encourage you to consider the gospel today if you haven't. Otherwise, remember that with God, all things are possible. Now, that doesn't mean ridiculous things. It means things that are according to the will of God revealed in the Bible. So, until next time, this is Eric Slay with the UWM Pen Guy, and this has been the Bible Commentary.